Marshall says, don't sit along the back. Come sit in the chairs. Come down here. There's plenty of seats. So. All right. So welcome back. I hope you all were able to enjoy some coffee and snacks during the break. We have a slight program change. We have a special video from the European Union Special Representative for Human Rights, Stavros Lambrinidis, and just a demonstration of the importance of internationalizing this issue. The State Department, I know, has done important work to build a coalition of like-minded governments called the Freedom Online Coalition. Highlights how important it is that it's not only the U.S.
Citizens who are supposed to be observing and judging the actions of the governments on a daily basis, not the governments who are supposed to be observing, judging, spying upon the thoughts or the actions of their citizens. If you end up going to the second instead of the first, you have turned around on its head the principle of any vibrant democracy, any civilized democracy. You have turned around on their heads human rights. One fact: the internet today is the means through which increasingly we exercise a number of other fundamental rights. The freedom of expression, the freedom of association, getting organized, the right to education, even commerce. In that sense, the internet itself and access to it could be said to be a new fundamental right. We need the internet. The danger is that in the same way, at the same time that the internet increases our ability to exercise a number of fundamental rights, it also opens the door, opens the space for their violation. Every government in the world, every police, every company, even criminals, want to have as much access to private information as they can for their own purposes. And the internet indeed opens that door. And when you're talking about repressing governments, then observing what I say, trying to silence me, even arresting me and throwing me in jail for what I say or do on the internet is something that we see increasingly happening. Now, given the principle, given the fact, given the danger, what is the solution? In my view, the only way to deal with this problem and this promise is to deal with cyberspace exactly as we would with our regular space. Make sure that we apply in the internet the same laws, the same safeguards on the freedoms that we have that we apply outside of it. Let me give you an example. If a post office were to open up every letter that we send, we probably would think that that is a tremendous violation of our rights. If it were to read every letter that we send to see if we are possibly a terrorist, or if we are possibly someone who wants democracy in a country that doesn't have it, then we would say, basta. The fact of the matter is, in the internet world, it is very, very easy, without anyone knowing, for anyone to open up that private information. Should we allow it? Of course not. Can there be exceptions? Yes. The same ones that exist in our real life. So, for example, there may be legitimate reasons for which a government may survey some people on the internet. But there's got to be a law on that. There's got to be a legitimate purpose to do so. Any measures taken have to be necessary and proportionate, and the decision cannot be made by the governments themselves. The decisions have to be made by independent authorities, judicial authorities or other authorities. If you do not have these guarantees, you are in major trouble. Well, some governments will come and tell you, what's the big deal? Are you a terrorist? Are you a criminal? No, I will answer. Well then, why are you complaining? If you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. My answer to that is, if you have nothing to hide, you probably don't have a life. Get a life. We all have something to hide, something absolutely legitimate to hide, whether it is our political beliefs or our credit card numbers. It is a red herring argument to claim that you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear, and we have to fight against it. This is precisely what the EU is doing. The EU has committed itself to promote freedom of expression and freedom of the internet around the world through its policies. Let me give you some examples. In the new strategic framework for human rights that was adopted last June by the 27 member states of the EU, it is underlined that the EU will promote in every way it can freedom of expression, including on the internet, around the world. The EU, in that same document, also commits itself to ensure that it will make impact assessments on the rights of expression and internet in policies that it takes around the world, whether it's for cybersecurity, or whether it's for cybercrime, or whether it's for internet governance. In other words, we commit ourselves to make sure that the policies that we adopt are policies that will be consistent with our principle to promote internet freedom and not to limit it around the world. Second thing that we do, of course, is that we constantly monitor and condemn openly restrictions on the internet, especially when they take place against bloggers, activists, journalists, and others around the world in order to silence them and to silence their free expression or their free association. A third thing that we do is that we have imposed sanctions in the case of Iran and Syria against exporting materials that can be used to survey citizens. And we're considering, as we speak, the potentiality of increasing those sanctions in other cases. The fourth thing that we do is that we have established a very sophisticated, a very complicated process we call the no disconnect strategy, in which the European Commission, in cooperation with the EAS, in which Cathy Ashton, who is the High Representative for Foreign Policy in the EU and the Vice President of the Commission, and Neelie Kroes, who is the responsible commissioner, provide the tools in non-democratic situations for people to be able to circumvent cutoffs of the internet, to be able to prevent themselves from being followed or spied upon, to do everything possible in order to create an open environment where governments, some governments, are trying to create a closed one. A fifth thing that we do is that we support civil society in these arrangements through very specific funding, through the European Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights, as we call it. We don't just simply stay in words, we also apply those issues in deed. A sixth thing that we do is that we place emphasis on corporate social responsibility. Corporations around the world today, as every one of you in this room knows, increasingly do things that can affect human rights, whether positively or negatively. In the EU, we have 3 pilot programs now to apply corporate social responsibility. One of the 3 has to do with the IT business and IT. Dear friends, these efforts, these EU policies, these EU commitments mean very little unless they're done in cooperation with others around the world who care. The United States does, and I am pleased to be able to be sending this message in what is probably, Mike, I'm not sure, but I'm assuming one of your last appearances in this position. Mike Posner has been a true advocate and fighter for an open internet, for a multi-stakeholder approach, for precisely the things that we at the EU as well do. And we have been cooperating very closely together. It's very important for us to be able to preserve that openness, that multi-stakeholder nature of the internet around the world, and to do so in multilateral fora, as we did during the 3rd Committee in New York this past December, and to keep up the good fight. Thank you so much for organizing this. I'm very sorry I cannot be with you, but I assure you that we will be in close cooperation in the future, as we have in the past, for the principles that we so believe in, principles that are not Western, principles that are not strange, principles that we apply on our daily lives, and we certainly should equally apply on the internet. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and I'm glad the EU is able to join us via video conference and to remind us that what we're really talking about here is the defense of old rights on new technologies, that's the foundation that underlies our whole conversation today. So we're going to move now into our plenary panel, which Dawn Nunziato is going to chair. Dawn is a professor here at GW Law School. She teaches internet law. In addition, she is the director of GW's Global Internet Freedom Project, which was started in 2011. So Dawn's going to take us through the plenary panel. Let me just do one more plug for the hashtag, which a lot of people I know are using, but just tech@state. So join the conversation online. Dawn, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and welcome to our plenary panel on technologies of freedom, technologies of repression. I will introduce my distinguished plenary panelists in turn, but we have Dilshad Othman, Robert Guerra, and Rebecca McKinnon, and I'll give you a longer introduction of them before they speak. So technologies of freedom, technologies of repression, or perhaps in Andrew's words, internet good, internet bad, right? What do we do about these difficulties that internet technologies present to us? So over the past several years, internet freedom activists have grown increasingly alarmed and concerned about the ways in which internet technologies are being used not just for the good purposes for enabling greater communications and enhancing freedom of expression, but also focusing on the darker side of internet technologies, to paraphrase Evgeny Morozov, to use these technologies to repress freedom both online and offline. We've seen, and Andrew spoke about this, repressive regimes increasingly using technologies, some of which have been developed in Western countries and Western democracies like the United States, like Germany, using these technologies to spy on their citizens, to surveil their citizens, to intercept their communications, and ultimately to harass, arrest, persecute, and torture their own citizens. Andrew referred to the Dark Comet remote access tool that is used in Syria, and perhaps we'll hear more about that during this panel. We've even seen democracies using technologies, similar technologies, to censor their citizens. So this panel, I keep my remarks very brief. In this panel, we pose the question, what can and should be done about the repressive uses of such dual-use technologies? And some answers that perhaps we'll explore include regulation, self-regulation by the companies themselves, sanctions, circumvention, more technology, counter-technology. So to help us address these difficult questions, we turn now to the first of our three esteemed panelists, Dilshad Othman, who is with Internews Europe. Dilshad is an Internet system consultant for Internews Europe, who holds a degree in operating systems engineering. He's also a Syrian activist and IT engineer who provides Syrians with digital security resources and assistance so that they can utilize online communications and advocate freely and securely in spite of these increased online threats and online government repression in the form of censorship, sophisticated cyber attacks, and intense surveillance. He was chosen as a 2012 Internet Freedom Fellow by the United States State Department. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I think talking about the technology of freedom, technology of repression, Syria was a very good example to explore or to find this word. I will talk in this presentation about the technology of freedom, exactly what people used, the public people used to protect themselves, and what the government used as a solution. Now, back to 2000, when the internet, first time internet was founded in Syria, was in 2000. Syrian people and the civil society, they used the internet as the main base to act in the community. We had emergency law on the ground, which is not allowing more than 5 people to group themselves and talk about any public issue. It's not allowed because of the emergency law. So the internet was a very good example to act on that base. Can we go to, okay. So the Syrian oppositions, after that, the Syrian oppositions and the civil society, they start using the internet. So, I mean, we found that this kind of, I remember when first time I went to, and I got access to an opposition website and I read an article against the regime, I really was some kind of afraid, and it's something strange because we don't have anything, or we are not allowed to talk about this kind of things. So how internet brings this kind of new experience for us? So in fact, after 2004, the regime started blocking websites, blocking the social networks. Even they blocked the SSL layer between 2000 and 2006, I remember. So we hadn't access to any email services or even any secure banking system or whatever. We just had the SCS, which is the Syrian Computer Science Community email, which is 100% under control the government services. So people, they start to use some kind of simple applications. I will talk about them now in the next slide. Can we go to the next slide? Oh, okay. Thank you so much. So if we go back before March 2011, everything was different than after March 2011. We had a blocked website, and this is, if you can see the list of the blocked website before March 2011. Also, all the messengers, Skype, all kind of those applications, in period of time, they were blocked in Syria. So people, they used to have use some simple application, which is like CGI proxy. It's a simple website. You can go through it and pass to another website. It was very useful. And also some people, they used some free VPN applications. The system was very easy, actually, to hack in Syria. So we had some kind of like stable situation, and people, they deal with the VPNs. I mean, even the cafe nets, if you go to the cafe net, the guy who is like managing the cafe net, he will come and put the proxy for you so you can open it. That's before March 2011. But after March 2011, okay. After March 2011, the real threat started in Syria. If we go back to the Jasmine Revolution in Tunisia, so things people, they start talking about like movement in Syria also. So the regime, he was aware for this kind of things. So they signed a contract with the Italian company, and they bring very high technology like blue coats from United States and area spot from Italy. And they start really having this kind of semi-Iranian strategy in blocking the connections in Syria. After the uprising started in Syria, the regime started to shut down the internet in certain areas, like Daraa. The regime blocked the internet for more than 25 days in Homs. So people, they had no access at all to the internet. So it's not a matter of security, it's a matter of having access to the internet. So for this kind of things, people in the neighborhood or on the borders of Syria, like in the northern Syria or the south of Syria, they started bringing 3G SIM cards from those countries. So they had access like over the Turkish. In my city, my family, they use Turkish 3G line in the northern of Syria. In the south of Syria, they use Jordanian one. People in the middle, they start using satellite VSAT system, which is the internet over satellite. It's very, it's very forbidden. It's very dangerous if they found a satellite communication system in your house. That will put your life in danger. Even that, the people, they got this kind of communication stuff. Now, after that, like, let's say in May 2011, the Syrian regime started acting the real infrastructure that they have. So the first attack against the network was in May 2011 when they made fake SSL certificate for Facebook. So it was attack against Facebook. In that day, I remember more than 10 people from the main figures of the opposition, they got arrested and their accounts had been hacked just only by using this kind of technology for 2 days. So people, at that time, I remember we started going public, teaching people over social network how they can verify the certificate and how they can use Tor. So at that time, people start using Tor to solve this problem. At the same time, all the journalism or international organizations, they were denied to work in Syria. So the Syrian, they found the VDC, which is the Violation Documentation Center. It's an online database you can access and you can get all the reports of like martyrs, arrested people, all of those stuffs from online database, and you can do your search also. So that helped a lot of organizations. UN is one of those organizations. Block the connections. Syria and Iran and China, I think only those countries they have this kind of technology, which they call DPI. It is Deep Packet Inspection. It's I think it's a module run by Blue Coat equipments. DPI is going through the connections and find which one is secure, and they block it. So they are not allowing any VPN or any freeze or even Tor sometimes also to work in Syria. So for this kind of problem, people in Syria, I remember when I was in Syria, we start using Ops proxy technology, which is developed by Tor. So we are doing some kind of obstructions over this kind of technology. Now, I want to just make this small compare that the contract with the Blue Coat was by $18 million, I think, and the Ops proxy application is free. So the technology of the people was much more cheaper than the government technology, and it's still working till today. But Syrian regime, they support a group, it's called Syrian Electronic Army. It's a group of hackers, so they are going through websites and attack those websites. In a couple of months, they start using like secure hosting services, so they also protected their websites by using this kind of technology. Now, after July 2011, the Syrian regime started torturing people. When they arrest anyone, they are torturing them and get the password and username of their accounts. So they will go through the accounts, read the message, and arrest more people. So for this problem, some organizations, they build or they find a way to organize with the companies like Facebook and Gmail. So when they will arrest anyone, we have an online databases, so you can go and fill it. For example, if they arrested your friend, you will go online and fill this application that they arrested my friend. In a couple of hours, Facebook, they will suspend this account. So that was really great shift to organize between activists and companies. In October 2011, it was my first time I found malware, dark comet rat. I received a laptop from one of my friends, and she said that she lost all her accounts. So I was 100% sure that this attack is made by malware. So we discovered that the Syrian regime used the dark comet rat, which is open source remote access application, and they developed it to be a virus, and they hacked and they published more than 11,000 username and password for Syrian users, just public online. And they arrested a lot of people for this over this malware. So after that, we organized a group with some volunteer people from Google, from EFF, to follow up this kind of, and also some independent people to follow up this kind of malwares and to find solutions. The funny thing in this story is that the best solution for us came from the guy who developed the dark comet rat. So he killed his project after he knew that Syrian regime used it. He killed his project and he developed the anti-dark comet rat application. So he destroyed his application when he figured out that the Syrian regime is using his technologies. Now, after that, shutting down the mobile and the network communication, for example, in Aleppo today, MTN company is removing their towers, so there is no mobile coverage. People, they start to build a small Wi-Fi and mesh network in local areas, and they build over that network voice over IP services. So they start using their own smartphones to make calls over Wi-Fi, which is free, and nobody can control it because you own this kind of network. Now, we developed also an secure operating system because there is a lot of steps you have to do to be secure. So at least we found it's better to develop an secure operating system and give it to people so they don't have to be aware about what they have to do or some technical staff, I mean, maybe they are not able to do it. So this secure system, it's like secure everything for them so they don't have to do anything. At the end, I think that the technology of the people was much powerful than the technology of the government. Yeah, thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Dilshad, for a very, very powerful firsthand account, and we really admire the work that you're doing, and perhaps we'll have some more questions for Dilshad. But for now, we'll turn the floor over to Robert Guerra from the Citizens Lab, and Robert is a civil society expert specializing in issues of internet governance, cybersecurity, social networking, multi-stakeholder participation, internet freedom, and human rights. He's the founder of Privatera, a Canadian-based organization that works with private industry and non-governmental organizations to assist them with issues of data privacy, secure communications, information security, internet governance, and internet freedom. And he also works as a special advisor to the Citizen Lab and a Canada Centre for Global Security Studies at the Munk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto.
Dawn, thank you very much for the introduction, and I'd like to thank the folks at State not only for putting together this great event, but Michael Posner and Sarah and many others who've really taken internet freedom, what was a collection of activists that were working to create bridges with the human rights community, and really, I wouldn't say not institutionalize it, but really strategically build it. So I think this is a great event that brings all the people together, but also sets in play a coalition of countries and others that are doing that. So, you know, their efforts that were mentioned by Andrew are really much to be applauded. I also want to thank Andrew for his very eloquent and very comprehensive comments. It stole a lot of my points at the beginning, but I do want to build on some of them. And what I want to try to focus on, building also on some of the statements earlier, on kind of where I see what some of the key challenges are in the space that we're in right now. When Dawn asked me how I wanted to phrase my comments, I thought it would be important to be the skeptic, but at the same time the reality check in terms of kind of where we are. Because it helps us understand the framework of the risks and the challenges, maybe adjust our approaches, and really be strategic to what I think is a far more sophisticated, nefarious, and very challenging environment that we find ourselves in. Andrew earlier in his comments talked about going from net freedom 1.0 to net freedom 2.0. I would change that a little bit, and some of the comments I and many others have said is that we're in a state of internet repression 3.0. We've gone from simple blocking of websites by governments, a handful of them about a decade ago, to mobs of supportive governments or governments that are opposed to freedom online, creating their own groups, to now where we find ourselves in an ecosystem where there's cybercrime, there's organized crimes, governments are involved, there's malware, and I would say the very assumptions of internet freedom are being challenged not only in the technical space, but in the UN and other places, and we have the risk of the assumptions of how the architecture being pulled out under us while we're working. And so if that's the case, I would say that internet freedom is also at a 3.0 stage. I would say that a 1.0 stage was before the State Department and the US government got involved. Projects like the Tor Project, EFF, and many others were working really to bridge a divide that existed between a human rights community that was really starting to use technology and the efforts of Phil Zimmerman and many others that were trying to say, look, your data is going to be looked at, let's try to do some encryption. You know, these efforts were not necessarily coordinated. Donors like the Open Society Foundation, many others were trying to support it, but it's only when you get the heft of a government that tries to coordinate with others and bringing it that really, you know, brought it to another level. And I think now we're seeing that governments that we kind of talk about and don't mention, but I would say the opponents of freedom generally are now coming back full force and opposing everyone online. And so now we're having to equally change and have a far more sophisticated approach, which I'll get into a little bit. But I think that we're in that stage, and if we don't realize what the risks are, we really run the risk of having a false sense of security, and all our efforts actually leading to people being imprisoned and killed. So what are some of the challenges? Andrew mentioned them, the issues of surveillance. He talked about Syria. The work that the Citizen Lab has done, both that we've done in collaboration with EFF, but also with a network of like-minded organizations like Privacy International. We've researched and mentioned a variety of countries, Syria, as you mentioned, Egypt, Bahrain, but our landmark study we published in 2009, seems decades ago, was the work that we had done with folks at the Office of the Dalai Lama, where they reported that their computers were kind of acting up and kind of strange. And the researchers that we have at the lab recognized that there was a very sophisticated malware there, and our publication published or titled Tracking GhostNet tracked how not only the Dalai Lama's office, but groups working on China issues around the world were infected by what seemed to be kind of a malware, and we had access to the command and control server, and then did some follow-up research that showed that not only were NGOs targeted, but also a variety of corporations and governments. In one of our follow-up reports, we documented how the Indian military establishment had been severely compromised. This is back in 2009. And so the issue of malware has been around since then, and what we've seen, which is very scary, is that a lot of companies have realized that there's a profit imperative to actually create technologies that governments will want. Now, in the case of the US, where there's rule of law, those technologies are great. Whether it's because there's a lot of people using the internet at the same time and we need to shape the traffic, or in certain countries like the US where we see copyright being an issue and all these downloaded movies are a bad thing, we need to take a look at the packets, and we need to slow that traffic down or report it or disconnect people. And people may not like that, but that's the policy, and companies are smart and they take that policy and they bake it in the technology and gets deployed in the US. Now again, we have rule of law and that's a good thing, but what happens when that market gets saturated? Those technologies still exist, there's a market for them, and they go abroad. So that is the profit imperative, and that's a great thing. However, those technologies, I think as is mentioned earlier, do have a negative human rights impact. DPI, as that you mentioned earlier in Syria, is a technology that was used primarily for checking to see if copyright infringement was taking place and slowing that down. So one could say, and that's maybe one view, not necessarily mine, but some people say, is that technologies that were used to help monitor copyright infringement have had a negative consequence and developed technologies of repression in Syria. And so if we take a look at that, we just have to really need to make sure that when we develop tech policies here and that gets baked in technology, we have to realize what will happen 3-5 years down the road and try necessarily to correct that we are setting the norms, not only for what's permissible online or not, whether it's SOPA, PIPA, or the technology, but then how that will impact other countries. And so how we're framing that here is particularly important, particularly if we're seeing how they're being deployed abroad. So that's one thing in terms of that we may have a hand in the very technology that's biting civil society, and we really need to do a lot of more work to realize that, work with the policymakers and educate them that it's a great thing, and authors and folks that create content do need to get remunerated, but there is a negative consequence to some of that technology, and we have to realize that. Secondly, I could go on, but I think it's just the standards, and this is something that was mentioned, is that Andrew had a great slide in terms of the decentralized internet. Well, that's the assumption of the internet engineers that created it way back when. But if we take a look at China, if we take a look at Iran, their internet architecture is very, very different. It's much more command and control. Lists get created. One doesn't have to go to Iran and China. If you take a look at how mobile networks exist, those are far more controlled, that go through particular companies. And what those companies do with our data, their privacy policies, what they do with our geolocation data, do they keep it for 6 months, do they keep it forever or not, is really important. And how those technologies get deployed and what data gets collected and what we have access to is really important. You know, a case in point is that, you know, when folks sign up for their mobile service, it's really important to know what data is the company generating about you, who are they selling it to, and strangely enough, Verizon, if you sign up for a new LTE phone, you basically have a month to basically opt out. And the approach with the Europeans is that you have to opt in. And so these issues that, you know, what are technology providers and others doing is particularly important. But I would say also, so that's one thing. The other thing that I think that's particularly important is, again, building on what Andrew mentioned, is the growth of the internet is taking place in countries in the developing South and in the East. There are more people online in China than there are people in the US. And that's only going to get worse over time. There's more people in Indonesia going online than a lot of places as well. And so what those governments do and what the users do and what that infrastructure gets created sets the technological standards for, I would say, the next billion that come online. And so while we're doing a great deal of activism and technological support here and in Europe as well, we have to realize that the choices that will unlock or lock repression in the developing countries is there. And so in countries where there's still an opportunity to work with people, where I'd say, you know, in East Africa and West Africa and Latin America and elsewhere, where governments are starting to figure this out, we need to work with the activists there. In a way, our call to action, seeing what has happened at international fora like this wicked meeting in Dubai, it's the developing countries hold the key for the internet of tomorrow. And so we need to work with the activists in those countries. We need to do research with them to see what's going on and empower them to do the great work that we've done. So in a way, there's a torch that needs to go. And if we don't do that, what will happen is that we'll have our freedom, but the rest of the world will not. And so, again, there's a foreign affairs impact to internet. We have to be aware of that, and that's why it's great that the State Department got involved and it engaged countries like Kenya and many others. And so I'll leave it up to you. I could go on with a lot of points, but I hope some of these points are points for discussion after Rebecca speaks. So again, thank you.
And thank you, Robert. Next, we will hear from Rebecca McKinnon of the New America Foundation. And Rebecca is a journalist and activist whose work focuses on the intersection of the internet, human rights, and foreign policy. As a senior fellow at the New America Foundation, she's developing new projects focused on holding technology companies accountable to universally recognized human rights standards on free expression and privacy. As a Bernard L. Schwartz Senior Fellow from September 2010 to August 2012, she examined U.S. policies related to the Internet, human rights, and global Internet freedom. And her first book, Consent of the Networks, was published last year by Basic Books. Rebecca?
Thanks very much, Don. Coming after all these really excellent speeches, you know, sort of what Mike Posner said, what Andrew said, what Dilshad said, what Robert said. I think I'm going to try and reinforce some of the points that were made with a few bits of framing in terms of some of the concerns and the coming battles for internet freedom ahead. If I had a slide deck, which I'm not going to show a presentation, but if I were showing a presentation, I would just show one slide, and there would be two circles. There'd be a circle here that says authoritarian countries, and there would be a circle here that says democracies. And I think one of the problems is that kind of in the media and the policymaking community and the activism community, until recently, and still I think in large parts of these communities, there's an assumption that just because the internet exists, and thanks to the great internet freedom funding by the State Department, that these authoritarian countries are going to inevitably and inexorably end up over here. It's just kind of a matter of time, and these guys are going to end up here. The authoritarian countries are going to evolve over into the democratic area. But is that necessarily the case? And I'm actually concerned that given current trend lines, what you're going to see is, as Andrew described, China is becoming, there's more public discourse going on and more things happening thanks to the internet. Yet at the same time, due to basically the collusion between the private sector and the Chinese government, you can't use the internet to organize an opposition party or an opposition movement, because the people may have tweeted some stuff, but then the police show up later, so it kind of got out. But there's a lot of reasons why it's not getting all the way over here. And what I'm concerned about, also because of many of the policy trends that Andrew talked about, is that actually what's going to happen, potentially, if we do not succeed at Internet Freedom 2.0, is that we're going to all meet in the middle. The authoritarian countries, there's going to be a bit more discourse and more stuff going on. It's not the authoritarianism of the Cold War. It's a more kind of porous, discursive kind of authoritarianism, what I like to call networked authoritarianism. It's going to feel more fun and free and so on. But it's not, human rights will not be protected. Free speech will not be defended. And what I'm concerned about is that the democracies are actually going to move a bit further in that direction if we don't succeed in the fight for Internet Freedom 2.0. And Andrew talked quite a bit about some of the battles happening in this country and the battle last year to stop some legislation that was meant to protect copyright, but also there was great concern, not just in this country, but among activists all over the world, that the unintended consequence would be to put in place technical systems and legal practices and business norms that would make abuse inevitable, that would make it inevitable that people who were not just trying to defend copyright, clear-cut copyright violations, but actually wanted to use these mechanisms to go after other kinds of infringing content that they define as infringing, and that these systems would be used as for abuse globally. And so this is, as Andrew talked about, one of the problems is that in democracies today, we have a lot of issues that the internet brings. We have issues, legitimate issues of how do people actually get paid for their creative work, and that's a legitimate issue. How do we fight bad guys who are also empowered by the internet? How do we defend ourselves against cyber attacks? But we also need to make sure that in fighting Chinese hackers, we don't become more like China. And that is the challenge. And to talk about two sort of immediate battles coming up and then talking about the larger kind of context, immediately there are two things on the horizon. One is a bill that's been revived in Congress recently called the Cyber Intelligence Sharing and Protection Act, or CISPA. And again, there are legitimate concerns about defending our networks. Anybody who reads the newspapers knows that there are real concerns. But one of the problems with the bill, and one of the problems that civil liberties groups have serious problems with, is that this bill would allow for sharing of information between private companies and a range of government agencies, and it's supposed to be just for cybersecurity purposes, but how that's defined is very vague. And the protections against sharing sort of broadly defined cybersecurity information that could include Americans' personal communications with a range of agencies. And how do you make sure that that is not abused and that those agencies really only use this to defend networks and don't, that this is not then shared for other purposes, which in effect has the result of completely destroying Fourth Amendment protections and any kind of pretense of expecting that there should be a warrant before people's personal communications are shared with the government. So that's kind of one of the issues is, again, we have a legitimate problem, but how do we make sure that the problem is addressed without setting up systems that invite abuse that completely destroy civil liberties protections? Another battle that is that many civil liberties groups will tell you is looming relates to what's called the Communications CALIA, Communications Assistant for Law Enforcement Act. And there's concern that in efforts to revise existing electronic communications protection legislation to kind of update it for technical change and actually put in some extra protections, that along with that, the FBI and others, both in the Obama administration and in Congress, are advocating for an extension of the CALIA to Internet applications, to Internet services, which would basically require that these services be wiretap ready. And, you know, this will have, I mean, again, there are law enforcement concerns, but how do we make sure that this, again, doesn't completely destroy our civil liberties protections? And with a second kind of issue being that if all American internet platforms run by American companies and you know, sort of chat clients and so on are all required to be wiretap ready for the U.S. government access, is anybody outside the United States really going to want to use these things? And what is that going to say for the argument that governments like China already make? One of the arguments that the Chinese government makes about the United States Internet Freedom Program is that it's really just a cover for U.S. security interests. And so, again, if we're sort of pursuing a trade policy, an internet freedom policy, we want to make Google accessible everywhere around the world, and then we're requiring Google to be, you know, wiretap ready for American agencies. It becomes much harder to push back against those arguments. And it makes, I think, the balkanization of the internet that has been talked about by some of the other speakers even more likely. So those are two kind of immediate battles coming up that are part of, I think, this Internet 2.0, Internet Freedom 2.0 battle, which is really all about internet freedom starts at home. That, and you know, Robert alluded to this and others, that we need to figure out how do you address legitimate problems without destroying civil liberties protections? How do you get that balance right? How do you make sure that as you are legislating and shaping policy to address legitimate problems, that you're not enabling opaque and unaccountable abuse of power? Because we need to figure out a way to solve legitimate problems. And this is the responsibility of democracies today, that we need to come up with a model for how do we ensure that, yes, as law enforcement is doing what citizens want it to do, that national security agencies are doing what citizens want them to do, that it's possible to know when abuse is taking place. It's actually possible for citizens to find out when power has been abused, number one. Number two, that there's some kind of safeguard against abuse. And number three, that when abuse happens, somebody gets held accountable for it. And if we cannot enable these safeguards in the way we go about solving our online problems, that's not only, very bad for the future of democracy in existing democracies, but it's going to make it much less likely that countries like Syria or Iran or China are going to go in the direction that many of their citizens would like them to go. And finally, to echo Andrew's point about corporations, I think that it's absolutely essential that this intersection of corporate power and government power, that when information is being shared, when governments are making demands on companies, when corporate privacy policies are sort of interacting in different ways with government surveillance practices, kind of in unexpected ways that result in people getting tortured for their passwords and so on, that companies are thinking through the human rights implications of their business decisions, that companies are being transparent and accountable with their users about how they are handling their relationships with government. There was going to be a Google person on this panel who couldn't make it because I understand he was sick. But Google's I have not 100% praise for everything Google does, but I've got to say that Google's transparency report, where they release data on the number of government requests for user information and the number of government requests to take down content that they're receiving from governments all around the world, that's a very laudable thing they're doing. That we as citizens should be requiring all our internet service providers, all our mobile service providers, and all web service companies to have at least the same amount of transparency about their surveillance and censorship relationships with governments of all kinds. Because unless and until we know more about what's happening, we're not going to be able to hold abuses accountable. And a couple of really interesting things from the Google data. One is that surveillance around the world, or government requests to Google, have basically doubled for user information all over the world and have rapidly increased in this country particularly. But the other interesting pattern that we're seeing from that data is that a large percentage of government requests that Google gets in lots of countries are of dubious legality in those countries, according to those countries' own law, which speaks to the importance of companies having policies in which they actually push back. And again, having a commitment to the rights of their users. In this country, many of the requests are around really dubious copyright takedown requests as well. But there are a lot of other things going on. And it's also with a lot of companies. There was a New York Times article not too long ago about mobile phone companies in New York and the way in which different mobile carriers were handling police requests for user data, sort of cell phone tower dumps after a phone was reported lost or stolen. And in many cases, in all cases except one, basically the police would request the traffic data of this user who had reported their phone lost or stolen without actually checking in with the user if they wanted that shared. And then this data being kept in a database long after either the phone is recovered or somebody's moved on and so on. So sort of this trove of data sort of sitting there without warrants. And it turns out, of course, the law actually makes it possible for the carrier to require permission of the user before handing it over to the government, but only one of all these characters was actually doing that, requiring permission. So there are a lot of things that companies are doing that are not sort of the most robust protections of their users' interests within the legal system. They're not even making use of the law to make sure that within compliance of the law, they're doing everything they can to protect us, even in a democracy. And if that's happening in the United States, you can imagine the extent to which companies are sort of, when in doubt, just hand it over, just take it down, even if they could refuse legally in that country. So there's a lot of issues like this, and I know that there are a couple of people here in the room. Susan Morgan, I don't know if she's still here, she's the executive director of the Global Network Initiative, which is trying to get companies to sign on to core free expression and privacy principles and then be held accountable. But there's a number of other projects going on as well, trying to shed more light on what's going on between companies and governments in this country as well as in other countries. And I happen to think that if people don't know what's going on, we're not going to be able to hold the abuse of power accountable, and that bodes ill for democracy everywhere. So with that, I'll stop.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Okay, I think we have some time for questions from the audience. Good to see. Here in blue. Can we get a microphone?
Thank you. One of the points that was made was the need to, I think the way you termed it was to bake this into the technology. What do you see as the role of scientific societies, professional societies for computer scientists, engineers, others involved in developing this technology? Are there new codes of ethics that need to be developed, or what other role might those societies and associations have in helping to promote some of these values?
Sure, I made the comment about that. I think it's one, let's make sure that the criticisms that are made during the development process and the standards process are really listened to, because I know on the issue of Kalea, the big discussion back then is the negative consequences it would have a decade from now, and we're seeing that play out. When DPI was coming out, all the technologists were talking about it. And for cybercrime, it's about 10 years ago when the European Convention on Cybercrime was being discussed. The technologists were talking about some of the issues that might arise, and we're seeing them play out. And I would say I'm also involved in ICANN. I'm on their Security and Stability Advisory Committee, and some of the engineers there, they're engineers that run the back end that we don't necessarily see, and they're sometimes the very first people that will flag some of the rights issues. So I think what's needed is that while the technology is great, I think there needs to be a lot of connecting of the different silos. So what I would say is that a lot of time when technology is being built, platforms, not to name any companies, but I think it's important that young engineers know about some of the rights issues that their technology might lead to down the road. And so there may not be, I've heard recently that MIT has something where they're teaching social skills to engineers. That's great. Let's teach them human rights as well. Let's teach them about how to do impact assessments. They may not care about the values that much, but I think if we expose them and then flip it around, and I think what we also need is a lot of the human rights folks. There's folks in this room that understand some of the technology, but I hit my head against a wall every day when I hear about yet another large institutional human rights organization that takes no precautions whatsoever, that has no technology officer, doesn't really care much about security because they just need to be really transparent while they're communicating with folks in Syria and elsewhere. And it just boggles the mind. So I think it's just those communities need to be brought together, and that needs to be facilitated by some of the societies that might care. The National Science Foundation could do something. It needs to be shifted into more neutral spaces. And then there's been a lot of work done already on this. And so I think that needs to be more readily available. And I would say that, if we want to make an impact in terms of in the standards track process before something gets built, those type of assessments need to be included in that process. It's not whether, you have, rough consensus. I think rough consensus and some other values, and it's going to take a long time, but I think there needs to be a connecting of those groups, and it's not easy. You know, the dictionaries and the terms and the politics are very different. There's been some inroads made, but I think a lot more work needs to happen, and that would be a great challenge that, if done right, will include, you know, will really be helpful. The problem is, where's the technology of the future being made? In China and in elsewhere. And so we have to make sure that the International Engineering Committee and others also get involved in that conversation as well, because if we make great technology that has all these controls built in, and some other manufacturer just doesn't have it and it has a much cheaper device, then that's the one countries will buy. And so it is not easy, but I think something that needs to be done.
All the way in the back.
That's all the way. You've mentioned several times that it is, and this is true in a democracy, somebody a lot more clever than am I pointed out that for a democracy to function, you need an educated and well-informed populace. It's one thing to get educated and well-informed on a lot of issues that are easily accessible, but when every member of the panel, and Andrew as well, has said, well, you just need to figure out who you're going to trust. And my question is, how do I figure that out? Surely it's not from reading the user agreement, all 28 pages, where I have the option of not using the service. I'm not sure that's even practical in the modern world in many cases. But how does someone who actually hasn't time to live the technology 24/7 get educated as to who is trustworthy and who is not, and how do you strike that balance? Because quite frankly, you see all the stuff. Well, I'll just stop right there. The implications are, I think, evident.
Rebecca?
Sure. I'll take a stab at that first. Yeah, I mean, this is a problem. And part of it is just kind of what sort of data is out there, and, you know, what kind of how information is presented, and whether people have access to it. And one of the projects that I'm in the early stages of working on is figuring out how we might do sort of a ranking of the world's biggest, you know, internet and telecommunications companies on free expression and privacy criteria to help people sort of wade through those issues in terms of the quality of their policies, whether they have commitments and practices in place, whether they're conducting human rights assessments or not, and all those kinds of things. I think, you know, and again, speaking to the academic community and others, there are a lot of gaps in terms of public information that we have a lot of work to do in terms of helping the public be more informed, and research that needs to be done, and helping people kind of have comparative information that's digestible, because yeah, the privacy policies and terms of service are really hard to decipher. So that's one of the issues, and we've seen this process, I think, happen a little bit in other industries. You know, so kind of issues about for consumers who want to buy products by companies that engage in human rights respectful labor practices, for instance, or consumers who want to purchase goods that were created by companies that adhere to certain standards of sustainability and so on, that there's been a whole kind of research community that developed up around those two and many other kind of issues to help consumers, to help investors, to help policymakers have more kind of comparative data about what's going on with each company. And it can be very complicated sometimes. And so there's a lot of work to be done, I think, on these issues to help the public be more informed. And hopefully, I think the more enlightened companies will see it as being in their interest to contribute to this.
Robert, do you want to speak?
Yeah, I just want to maybe add, I think, you know, there's two choices, and countries in different parts of the world have done it in different ways. I mean, one can go down the education route and not push that to government. And so then, just like we have a green movement because we care about the environment, and there's this whole industry, and there's a whole popular culture to make the right thing, to recycle and stuff like that. I don't think that's really kicked in the public awareness yet in regards to kind of technology. People kind of hear stuff that's going on online, but I don't think people have really changed the paradigm of kind of what they do. They know that stuff happens, and so there needs to be a leader of sorts. I mean, that's what you get for, you know, the environmental movement. There needs to be a leader that steps up that says this issue is important, and it cuts across popular culture and gets people motivated to do something. It's hard, but that's something that could be needed. In other parts of the world, what they do is they recognize that there's a societal value that's really important, and we just can't leave it to chance. And so we have to give the government the ability to do strong oversight and enforcement to take care of it. And so some would say here, maybe that's a nanny state, but if we really cherish our freedom, we just can't let everything go awry. And so there needs to be strong oversight bodies that can actually, you know, do stuff if government does the wrong thing, if governments do the wrong thing. And what really is worrying for me, and this is where I differ with a lot of people in this room, is that SOAP and PIPA was a bad law for a variety of things. It was basically going to introduce surveillance. We have what a lot of people in Europe say is a privacy law, which is the antithesis of that, which actually brings enhanced privacy protection. And it's not a law that's going to be implemented in every country. The way it's set up is the moment that thing gets approved, and it's going to take a while, it's a regulation, automatically gets deployed everywhere. And the veracity by which the US government and others are pushing back against something that would bring enhanced privacy to the Europeans, that actually drive the global norm on privacy, is actually showing something that Rebecca was saying, is on one hand, we're pushing for privacy online for activists, but then for our citizens, we're actually doing quite the contrary in international fora. So, you know, we can't have it both ways. So if we don't want privacy, let's just be open with it. But if we want it, let's strengthen the institutions that have a chance either here or internationally. So, you know, education champions or, you know, good policy, but put strength in it.
So I think that we'll have the opportunity to get into some more of these issues in our breakout sessions this afternoon. But for now, would you please join me in thanking our esteemed plenary panelists?